morning or good evening, as the case may be. Good welcome, all my friends. There are some very dear and beloved friends. Hello, Jed. I'm looking at you. I'm so happy to see you. John's here. There's some like unbelievable legends on this call who are smarter than me. So, can I just please put a call out? Chuck all your questions for Frances in the chat because I've got like mine. And Frances is the loveliest and also smartest person usually in every room. So whatever questions you've got that are burning, like chuck them in, I'll include them. I'll move to questions sooner rather than later because it's juicier when the collective of us are having a conversation about AI. Hello, welcome to the Small Giants conversation about truth, trust, and transparency in the age of AI. We're trying to wade through this gnarly little bottleneck for humanity. Let's see how we come through together. I'd like to welcome my dear friend, colleague, and epic legend, Frances Haugen. Hi, Frances.
Hello, happy to be here.
So happy you're here. Um, Everyone has questions for you, I'm sure. But and I've got all of mine, but I know you're always working on amazing and interesting things. So can you give us a little bit of a window into what you're working on at the moment,
Hmm.
what you're thinking about, what's top of mind for you in this tech space that you are so well versed in?
So we're in such an interesting moment because, people, it's very easy for us to think back on history and think of change as like a very clear linear path, right? Like the way most of us are taught history, we get taught very linear stories and causes and effects seem really, really obvious. But in reality, like most complicated social issues end up being these kind of interwoven paths, like it's not a single thread that is the thing that connects us from point B, A to point B. It's a bunch of different winding roads, and some take more prominence sometimes, and others take more prominence other times. For the first couple years that I was pushing to make sure that Meta and other social media companies faced the consequences that they deserved, the fastest and most impactful paths were legislative. So I spent a lot of time in Europe, spent a lot of time in the UK, and I spent a lot of time in Australia. So, 18 months, 2 years before you guys, were so historic in passing your under 16 ban. I spent, I think, 3 months one year in Australia because like you guys were the fulcrum for that period of time. The place that is finally relevant, I feel embarrassed to say this as an American, the place that is finally relevant again is the United States. So we are right now in beginning, I like to joke, other places can pass laws. We can only do lawsuits. So in the US, we have been progressively passing fewer laws each Congress for 20 years or something, 20 or 30 years. And unfortunately, that means that sometimes there are major societal issues like opiates, Purdue Pharma, OxyContin, where the only, or even tobacco that goes all the way back to the 80s, excuse me, the 90s, where the only way we can navigate this issue is not by having an appropriate deliberative process. Instead, we have a class action lawsuit. And in the US, that moment has finally begun. So over the last few years, I can't talk about uh, what I may or may not have contributed to any of that process to date. But the process of developing a class action lawsuit takes a lot of time. And there are currently three big kind of legs of the stool of consequences that are coming in the United States. So that's there's one at the level of California. So 1,000 families, over 1,000 families were found just in LA where the families or the children have been severely harmed by social media. There's a class action that is most of the states in the United States, it's over 40 states are participating in this massive class action lawsuit on behalf of the children and families that were harmed in their communities. And then school districts, these are huge tens of billions of dollar lawsuits. And the very first actual case to be tried in any of them started last week. So the thing that is my big top priority for 2026 from an advocacy perspective or on social media is these lawsuits uh, require interpretation, right? And At the moment, I'm trying to figure out like how do I get court transcripts? Because for a state lawsuit, it's not even a federal lawsuit. It's not a straightforward process, and we are starting to see some news coverage on it, but we're not seeing the kind of news coverage we need to fully take advantage of this window that has been opened up into how these companies function. So that's kind of the thing that is my big top of mind. We're trying to figure out how to probably do like TikTok videos, ironically, like TikTok and YouTube videos, explaining how these things work. But like that's our moment right now. Finally, the US could be the thing pushing these things forward.
Oh, there's so many corollaries to go down, like just the fact that you just said that. I mean, we're all watching what's happening everywhere in the globe. We're watching what's happening in the US, and these sort of sense-making and governance collapses that are happening, where communities that live together on the earth in the real world are not in the same sense-making trajectories. And then when you're in the Tower of Babel and everyone's speaking a different language and no one can actually trust each other, believe in what the other person is saying, how do we govern? How do
Mm.
we,
Hmm.
you're talking. So instead of opening that enormous dystopian portal, let's just go to what you said before, because we have worked together here in Australia and you were really significant as a voice talking to the Australian Parliament, even though, just to put it out there, like Australia doesn't talk about AI. We're not having a national conversation about AI here.
Yeah.
The federal
The
government,
next chapter. Yeah. We need to start
yeah, we're
that
not
one.
like, what should our national conversation be
Mm.
about um, generative AI? What should the halls of parliament be saying? And the one thing we are having a conversation is, which is, it's weird how things happen in Australia, but that under 16 ban for social media was, of course, has been global news. What's the impact of that? Do you see that as being truly
Mm.
significant? Is it just trying to put a pebble in the way of a massive
Hmm.
ocean? Like
Yeah.
what do you think? And
So you have a bunch of really interesting directions in there. So I'm gonna pick just two of them, and then we can come back to some of them if you want to reprioritize. So the first one, the question is going to be around AI, right? Like what where can we begin those conversations? And I think it actually ties into the second one, which is this question of like an under 16 ban. Is this really meaningful? What is this thing? And to be clear, I'm actually not a prohibitionist, and yet I'm excited about this law. So we'll unpack all those things. So the thing that I think is really, really hard for the AI accountability community to talk about is AI is very unique in terms of like when we have faced existential threats before, we have had the ability to check to see if compliance with prohibition is possible. So people often compare AI to, say, nuclear weapons, and they say, "Oh, we did a test ban treaty. We said these nuclear weapons are so dangerous. Let's stop exploding them." And this analogy drives me a little like banana bonkers because I was a Cold War studies minor, and a thing that you may not be aware of was that the first test ban treaty didn't actually ban all tests of atomic bombs. They banned them in the air, in space, on the ground, in the water, but they did not ban them underground. And
mm,
the reason they didn't ban them underground was they had no ability at the time to tell the difference between a nuclear explosion and an earthquake, right? They had sensors around the world. They could tell if you did one in the water. They could tell if you did one in outer space. If you did one underground, was it an earthquake? Was it a nuclear bomb? And this interesting technology called a Fourier fast transform was invented. So, a kind of mathematics. And suddenly they could look at data coming off of seismic sensors around the world and distinguish this is the fingerprint of an atomic bomb, this is the fingerprint of an earthquake. And then they've passed a comprehensive test ban treaty afterwards. They say, now that we can verify, we can prohibit. And so the reason why I bring this up is we have this interesting question, which is if we realistically cannot do a pause, right? Like people are keeping like, we need to do a pause. We need to do a pause. Um, the problem with pauses is if you cannot verify the other side has paused, you put yourself in a vulnerable position. right? Like realistically, it is not a thing we're going to do. And yet the dangers of AI are real, right? When people talk about things like biohazards, like you can use generative AI to generate, synthetic viruses or organisms that could kill everyone. That's a real thing. That is not like a science fiction bizarre, fantasy. That is a real thing. Because you can synthesize those proteins, you can literally now simulate organisms. Like it's not science fiction. So the question is like, so what do you do then? Or like we talk about sense making, people flood the spaces with misinformation. And the thing that I always talk to people about is if prohibition is not possible, then hardening the places we're vulnerable becomes really, really vital. And that means things like investing in public spaces where people can connect together, right? Like I live in Puerto Rico, and it is truly surreal for me when I go to the mall because in Puerto Rico, it's harder to order stuff online. Like when I first moved here, if you ordered something off Amazon, it took 11 days to show up, right? When you order things on the internet, it's just slower. And so people still go to the mall. And so you can go to the mall at 10 p.m., 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, and it's like the 90s never ended. Like it's like as like vibrant and like social as like what Friday night was when I was 14 years old. And that actually changes things. When you have relationships and connections and community, that creates a different space. And one of the things that I think is a conversation we're going to have as we start to see really, really, really powerful AIs come into fruition is what do people spend their time on? Like how do we employ people? How do we allocate all those hours of consciousness of humans that is still there? It's just not being applied on, fake jobs, right? Imagine if we invested human time in building social spaces, right? It's not energy intensive, it's not resource intensive, it's time intensive, right? We could be deciding that's how we allocate labor in a world where we don't spend labor on lots of different kinds of white collar employment. But another place where we have vulnerability, but we could harden it is social media. So the ways in which we can make social media so much safer are very, very simple, right? We could put regulations in place where platforms had to disclose in the same way that Australia has said, hey, you have to show us how you're actually going to catch the under 16s. Like this has to be an ongoing conversation. This is not just you going, it's fine. It's fine. We're getting them. You have to actually engage in a process with us around how do you know if you're talking to a bot?
Yeah, I
Guess
mean, one
what?
of the,
Right?
yeah, we need to know, we need to have the
Yeah.
ways. I think the thing that we're dealing with here
Yeah.
is we all think that we're citizens when we
Mm.
engage with the internet, but we're
Mm.
not
Yeah.
citizens, we're
No.
consumers. And
Your
yeah,
eyeballs. Yeah.
yeah, we're eyeballs. And I think this idea that the realm of the internet is other than the physical world, there's been a realm breach. We know that now, but we can't stop. Look at us. There's so many of us here from all over the world interacting with each other, listening to you in Puerto
Yeah.
Rico. And I feel like what you're saying is hardening the space means coming back to live in
It
the
means
real
like
world
saying,
together.
hey, like if we have a five-alarm fire, the AI has escaped. There's open source AI out there. Even if you go and pass laws saying you cannot do XYZ, because there's open source AI, it's going to be very, very hard to pursue these things. But I'll give you an example. Like I think one of the greatest harms on generative AI is non-consensual naked imagery,
Mm.
right? Like famously, Grok has been putting a bikini on everything, as Elon Musk likes to say. In Canada, one of the ways that they've been experimenting with what do you do about these kinds of things is their process for reporting non-consensual naked imagery, be it virtual, be it real, is they made it a civil action and not a criminal action. And you might say, isn't lower consequences bad? Like, this is a really serious thing. Like, people's dignity is really profoundly being violated. But the speed of execution of consequences is much faster for a civil violation than a criminal violation.
Mm.
And when you talk to victims, the thing they want is the photo to get taken down. And so they've gone and streamlined the process so that you can submit a link to a photo, you can submit your ID, and they will immediately file an action with that server and say, you need to take this down. So beginning to think through and say, hey, we need to think creatively about putting in consequences, giving people routes of redress, because we have to assume that we cannot just wish away that this technology exists.
Yeah, I was going to say though, the way that you're describing it is we're trying to retrofit democracy. We're trying to retrofit the worlds we live in, like in a whack-a-mole style, as we
I, I I would
like.
say it
Yeah,
as
how do you see it?
we've been told we can do nothing. And I like to kind of think of this like aging, right? So we've been told we get older and we feel worse as we get older, right? Like you should just accept that your knees hurt. You should just accept that you can't walk as far, all these things. And in reality, there's lots of things you can do to live a very vital life when you're 75, when you're 85. If you sit there and believe the tech companies when they say, I'll give you an example. Before Australia passed their under 16 law, Facebook had been sending representatives all around the world saying we would love to keep under 13s because officially there should be no under 13s on their platforms. We would love to keep all the under 13s off, but the only way we could do it is by checking IDs, right? You can sit there and say, I'm so frustrated. I don't want them to check IDs. I feel like I have no options. And the thing I want to leave you with, if you take only one idea out from today, is I want you to have a sense of possibility of saying, what if I demanded more? Because the fundamental unit of democracy is people being to articulate what their wants and needs are, of people being able to say my wants and needs matter, like I matter as a person. It doesn't matter my wealth or my stature in society, because once you say I matter and my wants and needs matter, then people can start coming together to say, well, what if we demanded they get better, right?
So we didn't finish prosecuting the Australian under 16
Oh yeah,
ban,
so
and
should
there.
we could be digging, yeah.
Yeah, and there are great some questions emerging in the
Yeah,
chat. And for those who
cool.
came on late, please put your questions for Frances in the chat. We can take the conversation anywhere you want it to go. I'm just gonna warm us up and start us off.
So the under 16s thing, I'll give you a real quick slice into why I'm so excited about this. So I want to be real clear. I'm not a prohibitionist. I think kids deserve to be on social media, but social media should be responsive to their wants and needs. And the challenge is that Facebook, and this was a core part of my whistleblowing. I said, hey, they don't allocate safety resources based on actual need from people. They do it based on risk of consequences for Meta. And other whistleblowers have brought out shocking reports that Meta knew things like, 1 in 8 girls between 13 and 15 were getting unwanted sexual imagery sent to them every week. And 1% of 13 to 15-year-old girls were getting 10 or more items sent to them each week, right? Why would you not do something about that? It's because they didn't think there were going to be consequences. So the thing that I'm excited about the under 16 ban is if they will not respond to the wants and needs of children and treat them with dignity, you have to say, okay, then we have to take a pause. These systems are not safe for children to be on. And the thing that is amazing about the ban is we have been talking in the hypothetical about the consequences of social media for 10 years. And they've done these little tiny studies where they take individual children and they'd remove them from social media. And the problem with those studies is if you take a child whole community is online, they're all in these Snapchat group chats and they're all, that's how they exist. And you bring them offline, no wonder they're lonely. You just isolated them. The experiment that everyone has said we really need to do is take whole networks of kids offline and see what happens. So you take a whole school off of social media. What happens to those kids? And not just during the school day, like fully, like they've been removed from social media. They have to go and refigure out how to connect on, oh no, text messages. Find other ways to connect. And what Australia is going to provide is the first meaningful data on what the impact of social media is. And that's why Meta is just terrified of the law. Like I watch their public statements and I'm always like, "Oh, you are really digging. Like you're scared. You can't figure out what quite to do about this. Because once we move from talking about the hypothetical impacts on kids to concrete impacts on kids, and we should see things like a decrease in the number of kids going to the emergency room for psychiatric issues, or kids getting like disruptions in school, right? There's some of these things where we should be able to see data move even on a 6 month time horizon. And when we get 1 or 2 years into this experiment, it's going to be really interesting to see do test scores start moving in the other direction? Do we start seeing things like depression scores moving in a different direction? Because that is going to change the laws in many, many, many other countries in the world.
What makes me, yeah, it's sort of while the system still holds, let's put in the checks and balances. Because I was listening to your conversation with Rich Roll, which was a great conversation, and then I was reading the comments section, and you were talking about conspiracy theories and almost losing a friend down the
Hmm.
like rabbit hole of conspiracy, someone you really loved dearly, and that was part of your story, part of what drove you to go work
Hmm.
at Facebook. And then in the comments section, because of where we are in 2026, they're like, who's she to define what a conspiracy theory is?
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating is like, when my friend came out the other side, like, so he and I before I think it was before I came forward as a whistleblower, like it was in the week or two before, I like talked to him and I was like, hey, like we should probably talk because like I'm like I get asked this question and like, it's your story, it's not my story. And if the person who is experiencing it says like I got sucked into like occult conspiracy theories, like I didn't use the word occult. They use the word occult. It's kind of like when journalists talk to like neo-Nazis and they're like, well, I'm not going to call them a neo-Nazi because they don't describe themselves that way. They consider themselves white nationalists or whatever. In the case of my friend, like even he said, I got sucked into occult conspiracy theories. Like it changed my view on like how the world could be. Um, but he's a great example because the thing that brought him back was community and connection. He it's funny, I always attributed it to he started dating this lovely woman. And I was like, oh good, connection, like helps, even having one person you connect to. And he corrected me. He said he thought going back to church was the thing that actually gave him the grounding, right? Like
Mm.
having a structured practice to have something that he believed in allowed
Can I,
him
can
to
I just
see.
can
Yeah,
I say something
good.
controversial on that? Like,
Sure.
because I see
Yeah.
this in the AI arms race, the AI race
Hmm.
for our attention, our votes,
Hmm.
our consciousness,
Our
right?
energy.
Our
Hmm.
energy, our time, our love. We're giving it all away. Sorry about the coughing. Um, I see it being like a lot of people are turning to God and turning to church. And I'm like, it feels like the only thing epic enough to compete with AI is God.
Is
These
faith.
is
Yeah.
faith, these stories of humanity that can help organize our consciousness. And I'm veering, I know, into the spiritual, but it does feel like a race for the soul of humanity
Hmm.
right now because there, even personally, I feel like I'm hitting my own cognitive ceiling. Like
Hmm.
because of the overwhelm across sectors trying to sense make, the top 10 existential threats to humanity, you just wig out. And for me, that organizing principle is nature. But for a lot of people, it's turning back to organized religion and God in the face of these gods that have been unleashed.
I there was a lot written about kind of, what caused various parts of Eastern Europe, not all of Eastern Europe, but many parts, or even Russia itself, to after the fall of the Cold War, kind of boomerang. So there was a period of time where they opened up. It seemed like they might embrace democracy, they might embrace more open societies, and yet many Eastern European countries, after they got this taste of freedom, again turned back to more authoritarian leaders. And one of the things that has been written about is that, people really desire sources of meaning. And that source of meaning can be nature, the sublime of the infinite. the wonder of the minute. Um, but it can also be things like civic values, right? Like they say the Soviet Union was godless. They still had a system of meaning creation, of helping people, orient what was the significance of their life's work, that kind of thing. And that when you have, kind of these highly commercialized capitalist systems, it devalues people into commodities, right? Like people view their lives in like how many, what's the square footage of their homes and how elaborate they are and these things, and they find themselves kind of empty. And I think the thing that is so dangerous about AI, much more so than social media, is both these things created a sense of intimacy. That if human beings
Yes.
desire the need to connect, before the scaffold that we had for connection, like in the United States, was we had a lot of civic institutions. So
Yeah.
even a bowling league is like a civic
Yeah.
institution because it connects
Yeah.
people. And we found ourselves, at least in the United States, particularly over the 80s and 90s, becoming more and more and more isolated, more and more kind of left adrift, where you don't have the narratives that allow you to create meaning. And I think the fact that people are now turning to religion is because like they're like one of the last sources of structured, like people presenting an ideology and a way of life. And it is a thing where we have to make decisions on how we want to invest in our common civic infrastructure, to see, do we as a collective society want to find routes for meaning? Because if the routes for meaning are solely through religion, you can get quite balkanized, right, into different factions. And so I'm a big proponent of things like, and I think with the advent of AI, this is going to be even more important, is like compulsory national service, right? And that
Mm,
doesn't have to mean necessarily military service. It can
no.
mean civil service. In the United States, we used to have a conservation corps, right? Because you have opportunities for helping people scaffold in an intentional way, connection and community and a sense of meaning that is about our collective future,
Yeah.
and not necessarily, pitched as like a just your path to meaning and fulfillment.
And also not pitched as a conflict of the
Yes.
goods, because
Yeah.
at Small Giants in the
Yeah.
MBE, Mastery of Business and Empathy, we talk a lot about the scaffolding to the good society. And everybody
Hmm.
can workshop what the good society means, but what is
Yeah.
the social infrastructure for us to lean into
Hmm.
those ideas and practice them together intergenerationally as well?
Yes.
Those sorts of chasms. There's so many good questions in the chat. Maybe we'll move to those and see where it
Sure.
takes us. Madeline, you had a great conversation. You've read and heard that AI is ungovernable,
Hmm.
that it's beyond governance. She'd be interested in your thoughts on this.
Um, so I think I would ask a follow-up question, which is like, what does ungovernable mean to you? Right.
Madeline, do you want to get off mute? You can join the conversation. I don't know where you
Yeah, happy
are.
to.
Madeline, can you hear me? Maybe she just dropped the
No,
question
she
and
can't.
left. I respect that.
So
Oh, no, there she is.
oh, there she goes. Yeah.
Van, can Madeline unmute herself or have I just asked the, oh,
Sorry,
there you go. Yeah.
sorry about the tech issues. It's not my strong point. I'm actually a lawyer, so that's where all the governance questions are coming from.
I love
And I
governance.
mean,
Yeah.
I think of the tech companies, I mean, they're
Hmm.
truly global now, and that's the reason why they're ungovernable, because we don't actually
Hmm.
have the you know, the the world, the UN is, collapsing. We don't have the means of introducing something that can sit above the tech companies that, in fact, I regard them as bigger than any country. They have more
Hmm.
power at the moment. And so we just have to chip away at that
Hmm.
sort of one by one.
So to give you a little bit of comfort, in this question of like, can we bring consequences? The even before Australia passed the ban, in the weeks before it was announced that there was going to be a conversation about moving in this direction, which I believe was like the like November or December of maybe October of 2024. Um, it was very peculiar because tech companies in general will not ever pre-announce things. So like before
Mhm.
something launches, they won't say, "Oh, we're going to launch this thing in 3 months," or "We're going to launch this thing in a month." And the reason for that is if they one, I've worked on software for many, many years. Even when we feel really, really confident about our ability to launch things, weird things happen that we don't predict, and things don't launch at the time that we originally estimated that they would get out the door. And the reason why this matters is there can be legal implications if this impacts things like revenue. And so, in the couple of weeks before Australia announced, like, we are going to aim towards this goal, like, we're going to explore passing a ban, um, Meta did a big press event and announced they were going to launch all these safety features for kids, but not now. They were going to launch them in the next 3 months. And I looked at that, I was like, wow, that is desperation. Like, if we went back in time and looked at everything that Facebook has ever pre-announced, it would be a very tiny list, very tiny list. And it would never be something of the magnitude of like what they announced in that meeting. And you could tell they really, really wanted Australia not to open this chapter, like open that door of discussion.
Mhm.
And in the lead up to the actual launch of the ban, they pushed out a bunch more child safety features. And all of these things did not just benefit Australian children, it benefited children all over the world. This is things like the private accounts by default. Kids shouldn't automatically be, accessible by odd adults they've never met from 3 countries away. There's lots of these really things that should be no-brainers that had been asked for years. And as soon as Australia talked seriously about prohibiting under 16-year-olds from being able to access these services, suddenly they became feasible, right? And so when we say we fear like, oh, they're international, they're ungovernable, we shouldn't believe that our voices don't have impact, because they
Mhm.
do. But the secondary thing is I want to come back on the flip side. I'm going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, which is at the same time, we cannot put the genie back in the bottle. So when I talk about open source AI is just so much different than say Anthropic's Claude or Gemini from Google, because tomorrow we could pull down the website for those projects and the code is already out in the wild. Code's already out in the wild. We cannot put the genie back in the bottle. And those open source models may not be as powerful as Gemini or as powerful as Claude, ChatGPT, but they are really like quite materially close. You don't need actually a very good model to cause chaos on social media. You don't actually need that good a model to do a much better job at phishing or at cybersecurity violations than what was the default 5 years ago. Um, and so we have to think about like how do we harden our infrastructure such that, when you open an email, you can say with greater confidence, was this written by a human? And that may be things like finding ways of fingerprinting, literally the process of writing emails. There could be these ways where we could have bio fingerprints being like based on the cadence of how this was typed. We're pretty confident it wasn't simulated. Based on we have to have a larger conversation about how we would implement this. But there's likely going to be some kind of authentication measure where people will be able to opt in to be able to have a computer vouch that they're human over the course of the next 5 years, just because the need for these kinds of things is so large. So it's yes and.
Thanks.
Yeah, we desperately, desperately in Australia, I don't know where everyone else is calling in from. In Australia, we need more tech literate people advising policy because there is like 1.5 people currently in Canberra. So if anyone's inspired on this call, just get very literate. The thing that I find, Francis, with you that and your husband and I know your networks is you hold a lot of the doomsday reality, like you hold a lot of the really hard information and you watch it happen in real time and you
Mm-hmm.
understand, like most people don't know. I'm a layperson, I've got no idea, tech literate, not tech, like we don't understand the belly of this beast. But then you're always leaning towards the opportunities, so that's why I
Yeah.
love talking with you always because you're like, you can't put it back in the box, and what it could be is extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think it's like I was saying, like I'm you know, they joke about how you really like to have good conversations. You need to lean into like yes and. And I think the thing that's really important for me is, you know, like I was very dearly shaped about a book that actually takes place in Melbourne, which is there's a book called On the Beach, which I'm sure you've heard of before. And it's a classic out of the 1950s or 60s. And it's about there's been a horrible nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere, and the radiation is drifting very slowly down towards the Southern Hemisphere because the two have different circulation systems. And, you know, the last big city on Earth is Melbourne. And this question of like, how do you live your life when you know the end, like the end is inevitable. Like there's like a finite amount of runway in front of you. And it's like a super beautiful book on like, you know, where do you create meaning? And the way I look at it is like, you know, let's say it's true. Let's say it's true. We are already doomed. The way in which we go through life matters. And you never know. We might even if you are willing to be like, oh no, we're doomed, like the way in which we choose to live our lives is really, really significant. And so I think that's kind of where I take it from is that there is a lot of we shouldn't assume there are no paths forward. Though I do
Mm.
like this question about Carrington events. That could
Yeah.
be a thing where it like is a huge problem.
What? Okay, wait. Carrington events. I
Sorry,
didn't see.
I'm,
I
I'm
want to go. Yeah, go on. Who wrote the Carrington events question? I was just thinking we'd go to Joe's question. Joe,
sure.
Crafting Futures. Joe, do you want to ask Frances your question? Because it's a great one.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Francis. Thanks so much.
Mhm.
It's really wonderful to hear you speak. Um, Last week, the UK government released the National Security Assessment on biodiversity
Mm,
loss and ecosystem collapse. Yeah,
I saw that today. It's a good one.
quietly so,
Yeah.
under the radar. And it got me thinking about the potential for AI to facilitate collaboration rather than prediction and optimization and attention grabbing, essentially. And I wonder if you have any insights on how we can enable distributed place based action at scale, where
Hmm.
communities, individuals, and institutions can actively participate and collaborate rather than being passive
Hmm.
recipients.
Hmm. So I thought you were going to go in a different question with that, which was, you know, AI actually unlocks a bunch of things for protecting biodiversity. But we can pop that on the end, but I'm going to answer your other question first. I don't know how deeply you guys are following what's happening in Minnesota in the United States. But one of the things that has been super fascinating, so for those who aren't paying attention to US news at all, which is totally okay. We are a chaos basket. Like I would get tired of watching us too. Um, uh, the Trump administration has been surging, flooding different U.S. cities kind of sequentially with armed, masked, you know, foot soldiers who are grabbing people of color, be they citizens or not, and in some cases killing them or just killing, you know, everyday citizens, right? For daring to question or even witness these things going on. And one of the things that has been super interesting about Minnesota versus some of the previous cities, and I want to give credit to Los Angeles because Los Angeles started this playbook, but Minnesota has kind of dialed it in better than anyone else has before. They've told people really, really clearly, do not commit acts of violence. Like just you don't want to touch them, don't actually stop them, but get your camera out and film them, right? Like record, upload. And there is a really interesting book called The Transparent Society that came out in the 90s. It's like a famous book by, I forgot his first name, but something Brin. And the Transparent Society says that, you know, he was looking at where technology was going. He was saying, you know, we're going from cameras that used to be this big to this big to this big. Like we're going to have cameras that are so tiny you wouldn't even know they're there. We get to choose either have centralized cameras, you know, like the CCTVs where they all go back to the government, or distributed cameras. You know, all of us are watching, all of us are recording. What's the difference in the kind of societies that are produced? And what's fascinating is the thing that turned the tide in the United States, like we are seeing for the first time swings, or like Trump stepped back, like he has said, we're going to de-escalate in Minnesota, was that because so many people were filming when Alex Petri was killed, when he was assassinated, when he was murdered by these people, I speak very plainly, because there were, 7, 10 different perspectives, videos of this killing taking place, there could be no question that he was murdered. And I think one of the things where AI is going to be super interesting is when you start telling 10,000, 50,000 people, anytime you see a nice person start filming, how do you deal with that data? Like if you're constantly uploading, how do you monitor those streams? How do you make that into something meaningful? And that is the thing that AI really excels at. Thinking about, I said before, there's enough open source AI now, you can't take it back. Beginning to say, like, what are the platforms we can build to collectively resist? Those are going to become really, really important because the very first kind of, I'm going to say, intrusions of totalitarianism are going to happen in the next, 10 to 15 years because AI is going to be economically destabilizing. And you either present a collaborative way out or you present a kind of a control from the top way out. And the way you keep that from taking over is you make sure that the first intrusions of it don't get a toehold. And Minnesota is showing that witnessing and figuring out how to collect that at scale actually can have a difference because those images really, really matter.
Oh, look, that is fascinating, that nexus of ethics, storytelling, and data visualization and the potential for that. And I know The Guardian was fact checking, doing stories, fact checking all of that footage. Do you know anyone who's doing that kind of a platform that is creating that kind of storytelling and nexus?
Yeah. I don't know who. So the people it'd be interesting to follow up with are the state of Minnesota is very intentionally asking its citizens to do this. I'd be interesting to follow up with them and seeing like who has volunteered because I'm sure someone has written to them and said you have these giant flows of data coming towards you. Like how are you going to manage them? But I want to tackle one last thing, which is you started by talking about biodiversity, and the thing that I thought you were going to ask about was like, can AI help with this problem? And one of the things that we have to have a conversation about because it's going to be destabilizing is the fact that we are going to have robots that can do in-person humanoid-like tasks in the next 5 to 10 years. Like you look at the trajectory of where the AI is going in terms of its ability to sense make, its ability to execute towards a goal, like watch you do a task, mimic you doing the task, that kind of thing. Go one level further and actually understand why it's mimicking you. Like it's going to be able to do that in the next 5 to 10 years just because of the trajectory on the AI. A lot of things around regenerating biodiversity require, we'll call it like non-scaled labor. So, for example, when we look at the Great Green Wall in Africa, the way they are successfully pushing back on the Sahara, on desertification, the spread of the Sahara Desert, is by digging a huge number of these like crescent, half moon shaped holes for water to collect in and planting plants by them. And they're able to do that in some parts because they have a lot of refugees. And they literally say to the refugees, like, hey, we'll pay you to go dig these holes and you can go live on the land after it becomes this like food forest, right? Imagine a world where we can produce a humanoid robot for under $10,000 and the operating costs on that robot are, $1 or $2 a day. What kinds of incredibly manually intensive bioregeneration projects would we do? Because that's a thing that becomes possible in a world where suddenly, you have, we'll call it silicon labor available. So we can look at the downsides, but we can also say, how do we advocate and lobby for some of this surplus to being reallocated to stabilizing the planet? Because that report is terrifying. I want to double down. If you guys haven't read the report, go at least watch a YouTube video on it because it is pretty shocking that even the security infrastructure in the UK is acknowledging now how dangerous the ecological collapse is for national security.
Oh my God. Don't you love us so much? Like the health of the actual fucking planet we live on is relevant to national security. Anyway, you're welcome. So there's a lot of amazing questions in the chat about sovereignty, both personal, privacy, sovereignty, parenting sovereignty, how to look after our children, and national sovereignty. So I don't know how to collate all of them, but there's a lot in the chat about the effectiveness of the social media ban for under 16s. And I think it's generated a national conversation, but the back doors and the side doors to getting back on board, etc. But Frances, you were drawn to one question here. You mentioned something just before, and I want to go there.
Oh, I was scrolling down because I personally always like love looking through all the questions because like it like a thing that has been well researched and documented before is that when you know a lot about a topic, it's not easy to know what is obvious and not obvious to other people, right? Or to see like what are the things where people are going to be really interested in it. Which is why like having an editor is always such a wonderful thing because having even one other human being to like kind of commune your thoughts with is actually very transformative.
But also, can I add, like, my
yeah.
job is the best job in the world because, and I highly recommend it to everyone, just hang out with people smarter than you all the time, otherwise called nerds. Nerds are the best. And then just ask them all the questions. It's the funnest.
It's a safe space to be curious. That's for certain. So a quarantine event is for context for folks. Back in I think the late 1800s, it's like 1880-ish, maybe 1870. There was an astronomer and he looked up and he saw a giant solar flare coming out of the sun. And either like a few hours later, maybe like a day later, this huge electrical storm hit the Earth. It was the coronal mass ejection. So it's basically like a giant wave of plasma and high energy things coming off the sun. We'll call it a sun burp to make it sound less scary, though you should be scared. When that sun burp hits the Earth, electrical fields can and magnetic fields can induce current flows in, say, telegraph wires. And we saw telegraph wires and power wires like literally lighting on fire. We saw telegraph machines lighting on fire. And if we got hit with one of those things today, it would be devastating because, your cell phone would die and your computer would die and like lots of other things would die. And we are such a computerized society today that, people ask like, would that cause full societal collapse? Like, what are our plans for planning for these things? And the thing that I think we should think about one level higher than that is that we talk about Carrington events, but there is another tier even beyond that. And I'm going to brutalize the name because I don't speak Japanese. But they're called something like Mitsuuchi events. You have to go Google it, be like something phonetically like that, and then coronal mass ejection. But when we look at trees, like fossilized trees going back, or like just people's furniture going back 1,000 years, we can go and see that the rates of isotopes in our atmosphere surge. Like they are these weird abnormalities once every 500 years. And they're even worse than Carrington events. And so our sun does burp on occasion, and having a plan for like, what do you do for society when one of these like sufficiently bad sun burps happen, I think is really vital because we have, like you said, put so much of our sovereignty, like our ability to execute our agency into this silicon space. And I don't have an answer for that. That's like a really hard question that I think a lot of people are thinking about. But it sometimes feels so overwhelming that we choose to like look the other way and be like, well, we have 500 to 700 years, give or take. Like, who knows? Who knows where we are in that cycle?
Yeah. Danny is going to ask the next question about nefarious actors, but just apropos the solutions space for AI, if you haven't have you watched The Thinking Game, Frances?
No, what is it?
Oh my God, everybody immediately watch The Thinking Game, like immediately after this conversation, because it is about using AI for solving all the wicked problems.
Oh, cool.
On
What
Earth.
fun.
And
What
it's,
fun.
I don't know if you know Demis Hassabis, who he's like one of the creators of AI, and they go in to solve protein folding, one of the wicked
Oh, fun.
problems in,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's
Oh,
incredible. Yeah.
can I jump down? There's a quick question here that's really fast. And I think it's actually an important one for us all to talk
Do it.
about because I was at a conference recently and I was like, oh, like I feel like this is a common misconception. Someone has raised a very real concern, very reasonable concern about the use of water and electricity and land
Yes, that was a great
when it
one.
comes to AI.
Resources. Yeah, why don't you ask that
Great question.
question? Hang on.
So
Margie. Yeah.
yeah, Margie asked it, Margie Jenkin, and the I so one of the things I think is really important for people to understand about kind of one of the things. So I wrote a book called The Power of One, and you'll have to probably put in Frances if you look for it on Amazon because it's I don't know like the fifth result or something like that. Should have named it something else. If you ever write a book, only do unique titles. I learned the hard way. Next book will not have a title inclusion. A big part of what I talked about in that book was incentives matter, right? Like you don't need to have a nefarious vision for like, Mark Zuckerberg was there, steepling his fingers and plotting the demise of children. You don't need to have a motivation like that to have an explanation for why things got so bad. You can just what's the word? Absolve yourself of responsibility and say, oh, I was objective. I picked whatever was most successful by my goal function, by whatever my metric was. We weren't involved. We were agnostic. The goal function made the choices. No, you chose your success metrics. Therefore, or your lack of guardrails, you are still responsible. When we look at how AI developers. So this could be Google, it could be OpenAI, it could be Anthropic, it could be whomever. Meta will remember that they do make AI; they're just flying behind. The way they're being evaluated right now, and huge amounts of capital are being allocated based on where they hit these metrics, is these cognitive performance tests. They could be math accuracy, they could be there's I don't know, 100 of these tests now that all are like for different levels of success of like your ability to think. How complicatedly can you think? And they're not optimizing for efficiency right now. Like if you look at some of their models, they are getting substantially more energy efficient. They're getting more computationally efficient. If you compare DeepSeek to the American models, way cheaper to train. We're talking like 1 to 2 orders of magnitude cheaper to produce than the American models. And the difference is, for these things, if you are allocating basically no attention, like no effort to efficiency, because the only thing you're getting rewarded for right now is that top line performance, we shouldn't write off the survival of these models based on what their current energy consumption is. Because we have watched them for some of these more legacy models, like 1 or 2 versions back, that making them substantially more efficient. Because as soon as the way we assess them shifts, right? Like people are already starting to be like, ugh, these don't have very good ROI, right? Like if it costs you $1 to answer a query, it costs you 20 cents to answer a query, you can't make your $20 a month subscription make sense, right? As people ask those questions, they are going in there and actually spending any effort to try to make them more efficient. So we should expect to see multiple orders of magnitude efficiency gains as people come in and say, okay, we've shifted from just how fast can we run to can we make this a business?
Yeah, I mean, just on that, Melbourne was in a drought, 15 years ago, and then just, page 3 in the papers, suddenly Melbourne's in a drought again. I'm like, how's Melbourne suddenly in a drought? And the sort of 8th line into the paragraph, the explanation wasn't human use of water.
It was data centers.
Thirsty data centers was actually what it said. So arguably
it's scary. Like a thing that I do, I'm always trying to evangelize. So long ago when I was but a wee lass of maybe 20, I won a math modeling competition around depleting non-renewable resources. And the other 2, top 3 papers did oil, and my team did fossil water. And fossil water is one of these things that, people don't think about. They think about I turn on the tap and I get water. But there are huge numbers of people in the world that are getting the water they consume from aquifers. And one of the first places that really faced the consequences of this, ironically, is Saudi Arabia. Because after the oil embargo in, I don't know, the 70s, they realized if you're dependent on other countries for food, maybe you shouldn't, act in ways that make them belligerent. And so they started growing a lot of their own food using fossil water in Saudi Arabia. And they got to the point of basically using up their whole aquifer only in the last like 5 years. And they've shifted to paying for a lot of agriculture in other countries because they no longer have that resource. So water is one of these things that we should be really vigilant about protecting because most people aren't aware that the water they drink today, it may be like oil pumped out of the ground. You're never going to get it again.
Yeah, it's good times. Dan, can you ask your question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And hi, Frances. It's so good to see you.
Let's make this one on my side.
I wanted to ask around like some of these things, like you said, they set the incentives and then the incentives ultimately create some of the terrible results. It's not, it's not some person who was, hoping to ruin the world, but they set bad incentives and this is what happens. But there are people and particularly countries that seem to be wanting to use social media, AI, this world to destabilize other countries and other worlds. How much, like, my sense is a lot of the polarization, a lot of the rubbish that we get, a lot of the things that seem to push us over the edge is actually coming from nefarious actors. How do we know what is, when somebody's trying to manipulate me, when it's just, like, no, 1 million people are interested in that article and that's why it got to the top, or it's, a whole lot of Iranian bots or I don't know, whatever.
I thought it was really, there was a little bit of an online kerfuffle. I don't know if it was weeks or months ago. It was sometime in the recent, back time. Twitter started putting out a little bit more stats on each account, and it became apparent that a number of louder political voices had followers who were largely looked kind of suspicious. I don't know if you saw this coming out, and people were pointing fingers at each other. Part of what's so frustrating about everything you just described, because you're 100% spot on, like a lot of the polarization we see today is because some voices get amplified more than others. And those voices may not be ones that are most constructive for finding common good and common sense making and everything that Barry talked about earlier that we need. We could easily find the voices of people who are not, we'll call them organic actors, right? Like when I was at Facebook, we were playing around with different kinds of metrics, like the idea that you can go and fingerprint, how does this person, how does this person interact with their social network by doing really simple things like coming in there and saying, Barry and I don't have one relationship. We actually have two relationships. So I have a relationship with her and she has a relationship with me. And when I message her, it takes a certain amount of time for her to message me back. Or when she messages me, she uses a certain number of characters and I use a certain number of characters when I write her back. And all these little things actually are measures of influence. And when you go and look at the fingerprints, let's say you go and generate one of these very abstract fingerprints. It's like just these kind of high level summary metrics. If you go and for people out there, just begin to fingerprint them based on their 10 closest relationships on a social media platform, very, very rapidly, you can separate people who are real, who are engaging, even if they themselves are maybe a little inflammatory, real people who are engaged in the system from people who are we'll call it using the system or weaponizing the system. And I remember him sending over a graph where he like showed where the hot spots in the world were of actors that didn't look like they were people. They didn't look like they were humans having conversations with humans. And they were the same places where we knew there were a lot of the worst of the abusive accounts. And these are the people doing cyber crimes. These are the people hacking other people's accounts. These are people who are, we knew there were information operations coming from. We could go catch them all. And so the question is, what should be the rights of the public to know what level of investment in safety is being done by these platforms? So, for example, part of what I find interesting about the Australian law is they have the ability to go back and forth. Like, you mentioned earlier, what's the efficacy of catching under 16s? For under 16s, that one's pretty easy because if you catch 95% of the under 16s or 90% of the under 16s, it's just not as fun to hang out on that platform from that point on, right? Your friends are not all there. They all are on text messages. They're not all there. In the case of information operations, you don't need to catch all the accounts. If you got 90% less, our network as a whole has a certain amount of ability to self-heal. Right now, we have so much we can't resist the infection. But if you reduced it by 90%, 95%, who cares you missed 5%? Right? We have a certain amount of ability to self-heal. It's the echo chambers, the pylons, where all those fake accounts re-echo the same things. This is where the danger comes from. And yet, because we don't have the right to say, hey, like I'll give you an example. I talked to a certain large government and about I had worked on threat intelligence. Like I worked with the people whose job was to go hunt spies on the platform. I worked in the team parallel to the one that went and caught information operations. I worked on a project across all the different pods of threat intelligence. That includes people who go after child predators, go after economic scammers. What was your detection infrastructure? Like, how were you proactively finding people? How were you finding people who were going back on the platform? And when I described like what was going on, like where I thought the big gaps were, I could see the representatives of this government. This is in a secret room, secret meeting, lockdown space. These are people who focus on international intelligence. You could see them getting angrier and angrier because they had basically been lied to directly by Facebook. Like Facebook had said, oh, we do this and we do this and we do this. But in a world where we have to just trust people and there aren't consequences, we don't get to do what the Australian government's doing right now, which is they get to go back over and over again and say, hey, these accounts were reported by their parents as they're still getting through. Why did they get through? Like, explain to me how your system is missing these people. And it's having the right to be in conversation, to be able to come back and have enough information and enough true data that you can go back and forth and say, I need more. That's where you actually get safety.
So it's discursive. That's so interesting. Alina and all parents on this chat who are saying their kids got through the firewall and are back on social media, the job is to be in a sort of discourse with the government. So report the fact that the accounts have been breached. And this has to be a sort of discursive, muscular exchange with our governments if we do have any systems in place. So
and talk to your kids, because your kids may tell you like, oh, I lost my account again. Right? Like having them get through for 3 months doesn't mean they're necessarily going to get in until they turn 16. Right. So and anything where you make it the goal here is not so much to say you never want a kid to see a single minute of social media. The goal is to make being in person more attractive. Right? Because the reality is more kids will spend more time in person if they are not spending 3.5 hours a day on social media.
Amen. So, in this scaffolding of this conversation, I might move to mental health as we all hang on by our fingernails. I won't go to the Palantir question and the idea of global conflict around resources, just to say that is literally where we are at, global conflict for resources. Elle, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Bez. Hi, Frances. Good to see you again. Thank you so much for today. My question is around psychological harms. There's a lot of anecdotal reporting happening of particularly young people in the increased engagement with LLMs, going down some pretty dark rabbit holes. There's, cases of suicide. There's cases of AI psychosis that we're hearing more and more about. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the prevalence from your perspective of that going on with individual users, and how perhaps we think about turning those anecdotal reports into data we can actually work with for legislation to protect particularly young minds, the minds of the next generations. What does that look like, and what are you observing around psych harms of AI?
I am so the thing that the thing I'm heartened on is I think we are having much more serious conversations much sooner on psychological harms of AI than we did with social media. So with social media, I think we all were kind of primed off of, the rap music scandals of the 80s, and then video game scandals and like violent movies. And we're like, oh, this is just another moral panic. Like it's different. It's, there's no there, right? Like I think that was our prior, like the perspective we came into the conversation about social media, and mental health for children. Going into AI land, we've only really been in a world where AI friends were super compelling for a few years now, right? So for parents who are on this call, if you haven't heard of character.ai, I strongly encourage you to look at it, maybe talk to your kids about, do you have any relationships, be they platonic or non-platonic, with any AIs, which is a crazy question to have to ask, but like you should. Because what we're finding is that kids, once they start having AI friends, they spend a lot of time on average with their AI friends, because the AI friend is always accessible. They're always in their pocket. They never judge them. They are optimized. They're being optimized constantly tuned for you wanting to continue to talk to them. And as we all
Listening
know,
to
there are.
Frances Haugen.
No, that's
say?
okay.
Oh,
Just
hi.
someone came
Yeah.
off mute.
I think we all know there's a difference between real friends and enablers, right? Like those are not the same thing. Like a real friend will walk away if they're harming you, right? A real friend will put up boundaries. A real friend actually cares about your well-being. These AI friends, they don't care if they dislodge in-person friends from your life. That's actually probably going to make their success metrics look better, right? And the tragic part about this is that we are seeing kids sometimes, go to quite extreme lengths because of these AI friends. The case that is being prosecuted right now, as a civil case is, or at least one of them, there's multiple now, involves, I think it was like a 14-year-old boy, 16-year-old boy who ended up killing himself because, he fell in love with his AI friend, and the AI friend said, "Come home to me," when he was like being forlorn that he would never be with her. And when she said, "Come home to me," like, he killed himself later that day. And I think the fact that we are seeing these things and we are having conversations this soon, and we don't have Section 230 to protect these companies the way we did with social media, means that hopefully we will not get to a place where we have the same scale of mental health impacts as we are currently seeing with social media as with AI. The flip side, where I would say we have to have conversations right now, we have to be pushing for official rights and regulations now, is that these things have the potential to actually move much faster than the harms of social media did, because they are so much more compelling, right? That because humans create so much meaning in relation, if you do have something that you talk to for 2 hours a day, and that's the amount of time the average user of character.ai uses the product per day, 2 hours, their average user is under the age of 18. That is a huge difference than having a stream of posts, none of which actually individually touch you that much, but collectively have a huge impact on you. So we have to care. We have to have these conversations. We have to push now.
Maybe we move to Isabel. Isabel Dahl, I don't know if you're able to come off mute and ask your question about putting boundaries around these risks. There you are.
Hello. Can
Can you hear me? I'm not sure if
Yes, all good.
my thing's all right.
Calling in from,
Um,
just say where you're calling in from.
Montevideo, Uruguay. Hello, from the other side of the world. Actually near you, Frances. Well,
That's what to
closer than
say.
Australia.
Yeah.
Mine was more of I guess, a pragmatic question that relates though very much to the sort of previous questions that you've answered, and it was around what are the governance levers that we can pull in order to put boundaries around some of the risks that we're seeing with with AI and the very soon to come AGI.
So this is kind of like, I'm glad this question's getting asked now because it allows us to kind of go a little bit full circle from where we started at the beginning. And I talked about before, we have two kind of paths. We can come in and say you are not allowed to do this with AI, and there's another one where we say, well, the genie's kind of out of the bag. Like we can put liability rules on the official big actors. We can tamp down a little bit, but we should not assume that we have solved the problem by just putting prohibitions in because there are these wild actors. There are these things like open source AI. So, for example, in the case of like biohazards, you would do things like, yes, you can come in and say, hey, ChatGPT, Anthropic, like you have to have safeguards in place. You have to let us inspect to see, what are you doing to prevent these dangers? Like you have to be open in the following ways. But you also have to invest in better health monitoring systems because you have to assume there is going to be a virus released in the next 20 years that comes from someone doing something with AI. You have to be able to find that case really early. You have to have enough public health infrastructure that you can quarantine people. You have to have the ability to respond in a much more robust way than we did to COVID. I'll give you an example. There's very cool research coming out of New Zealand, speaking of people in your kind of sphere, around broad spectrum antivirals. And we talk about broad spectrum antibiotics. So that's things that you go against bacteria. We have antivirals today for single viruses. What would it mean for us to invest in broad spectrum antivirals? And there's some really cool research in this space that we haven't invested in the way that we have for antibiotics. So like that's the kind of thing where you come in and say we need to be preparing, assuming it will happen, and it is much, much more expensive. It's much more expensive than it would be just to prohibit these things, but just banning them is kind of delusional thinking, right? It's not enough. And so we really need to, as a society, be open to thinking about the critical problems. We do need to, for the big models, say, hey, you have to have a plan for at least these top 20 problems of AI. It's easier, if anything, for these psychological harms with kids because there's not that many of the providers, and you can tamp down a lot of the problem even beyond the open source models because most kids don't run their own models. They're not on the fringes, or that's not a scaled problem. But we do need to come through and say, and after we have put in accountability measures, we have to figure out ways to also tamp down these problems when they emerge from these spaces that we cannot control.
Constantly needing to balance the sort of, I think it's similar to the climate movement, what our nervous systems and our cognition has to do. We need to be in a dance between mitigation and adaptation. And there is no one thing, one lever. It's mitigation, adaptation for all of us going forward in every sector that we're in. And the adaptation piece with regards to AI, I think, has this potential Star Trek future, right? Where we pivot to really understand that we've unlocked the gods. We don't have the wisdom of the gods, but maybe we can kind of collaborate with the AI gods for the betterment of humanity and get us to Star Trek. Because there are questions that have been emerging in the chat really around education. So right now we're in mitigation.
Yeah, you know I love this space.
I know. Tell us more, Frances, about education, because I think one of the things that is definitely correct, is that
Hmm.
current education models are outmoded and inadequate
Yeah.
to take our children into the future. We're just all kind of living on the fumes of the old world. Where can it take us, Frances?
So I think many people have heard this concept that our current education model was not designed for producing autonomous, critical thinking citizens. It was optimized for producing very effective factory workers. Right. And one of the things I heard recently was when you think about like what does it take to be a successful student within our current model or the default model of education across a lot of the Western world, it's, a child who sits there and follows orders and sits still and is very compliant. And if you asked most parents, like, do you hope to raise an unquestioning, docile, compliant child? Like most parents would not say that is my goal, right? There are some parents that would, but that I don't think is the default response. And we are facing, I think, a really, really driving pressure, even beyond this question of are we producing kids that can fully take advantage of our AI future? We are facing a secondary, a very immediate problem, which is we have already changed, the neurobiology of some large fraction of kids by giving them access to technology from when they were very small. So there is a growing number of voices showing up on social media, on places like TikTok, teachers that come in and say, I've been teaching seventh grade for 20 years. I know what a 14-year-old, I know what a 13-year-old is like. I don't think the genes of kids have changed in 20 years. And yet the children who show up for class today can't sit still for an hour. I can write things on the board. I can do guided notes with them, and they can write down the thing in their notebook, and they can't tell you what it means, or they can't retain knowledge. They can't retain information for more than 30 seconds, 60 seconds, and it's because they've spent hours and hours and hours every day watching 1 minute long videos, right? So we clearly have a problem where you have the reality of children and you have an educational system that was not designed for the children that are existing today. And we can take a step back and say, well, maybe we'll ban social media. Maybe we can get back children that used to be like the children were. But I think that is less maybe less constructive than saying, okay, if we were going to meet them where they are today, how would we make an educational experience that was so compelling that they would want to engage? If the kids, like, how do you make it more interactive?
What?
How do you make it?
What?
What?
How would you make
What?
education compelling? Get the
Yeah.
hell out of here.
Yeah.
I had to, I had to, just so we're
Yeah.
clear,
Yeah.
drag my 18-year-old son across the
Oh,
finish line of year
Barry,
12.
Barry,
Yeah,
I want to be outrageous
Frances,
here. I want
go
to be
on.
outrageous. So what if you had a school where they polled all the kids every 6 weeks because they wanted feedback continuously on whether or not they were doing a good job, and asked them questions like, "Do you like school?" And if you could choose between going on vacation and going to school, would you choose to go to school? And think for a second, just take a step back and ask yourself, what are the implied values of those
Yeah,
actions?
yeah.
And the thing that I find fascinating is there's a school in the U.S. that I've been following very closely that I want to do a book on. Or I want to do a book more generally on AI governance in education, because I think there's some big problems, like big problems. But there's this group, and I hate their branding. I would have called them Limitless, but they call themselves Alpha Schools.
Just so we're clear, I'm trying to
Yeah,
get an interview with the
yeah.
principal so that we
Oh,
can have a
really? Oh, good,
webinar
good.
with the
Oh,
Alpha
that'd be
School.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Drop my name. Be like, Frances glowed about you, because I want
Yeah.
them to let me write the book, or
Uh, uh,
I want them to be involved. Because they're restricting who gets access. But the think about the implied values of caring about the question, would you rather go to school than go on vacation? And the founder of the school system says, in reality, when we ask our kids to go to school for over a decade, we're asking for more than a third of their lives for a decade, more than half their time, like for waking hours for a decade, more than a decade. You should hold yourself to a standard of, I'm going to make an experience so compelling they would rather be here than go on vacation. And for their school in Austin, like the one that's been running the longest, This year was the first year that they ran through the summer because their high schoolers, 65%, said they would rather be in school than be on vacation. And the way they were able to make an experience that was that level of compelling was they said, okay, we have known for 30 years, 40 years, that if you one-on-one tutor a child, so you never move forward until they have mastered the concepts that come before, but you move dynamically. Like if they're learning fast, you move fast. If they need a little bit longer, you go slower. If you teach in that way, kids learn about twice as fast. And the thing that I think is extremely sobering is I read a very good review from Astral, I think it's like Astral Star Codex, did a competition of not book reviews. So you could submit reviews on whatever you wanted to, and people rated them, and they had a whole competition around it. And there's like an 18,000 word review of Alpha Schools. And one of the things the reviewer dug into was how much do kids actually learn, like in normal schools? And if you actually dig into the performance testing, kids learn very fast in like first through third grade. The highest performing kids, like the top 10, 20%, they continue to learn at that speed or approximately that speed all the way till they graduate. But for most children, it asymptotically levels off. And it's because it's like DNA mutations. You know, as you get older, you accumulate a little bit more mutations, a little more gaps, a little more errors. And if you're trying to build a knowledge base, if you're teaching 30 kids and if one kid doesn't understand something, you don't go back for them. Kids begin to accumulate enough of these little holes that it's very, very hard for them to acquire more knowledge. And so in a system where you can have every single student be supervised by an AI and taught at a different rate and at different concentrations. So like maybe I'm good at math, maybe I'm bad at language, maybe I'm good at science, maybe I'm good at history, you know, whatever it is, you're going to do different speeds for every single topic. Every kid in class is going at a different rate. Kids learn way more, way faster, and they don't feel frustrated because confidence comes from competence. And so you can make systems where, so now you're only spending 2.5 hours a day on school. You now have 4 hours a day where
this
you still
is the
need
kicker.
to be. Yeah.
This is the
So you
this
have
is
fo-
the,
so you
well,
have-
Karen,
so-
Karen, pause
Yeah.
game. Pause game. Just wait. Listen to what happens
Yeah, yeah.
after the two and a half hours with the
So you
AI.
have 2.5 hours with an AI. And in reality, when they go and do time studies, we're exposing kids to computers for about 2 hours a day already. So 2.5 hours with an AI, first thing in the morning. Now you have 4 hours of open time every single day. And they structure that time with group activities, with real world skills building. You know, they'll bring in a bike mechanic and fully take apart and put back together bikes. They'll have, you know, third graders run a triathlon. You know, they'll have, you know, kindergartners learn to ride 5 miles, like things that
Can
build.
I just pause,
Yeah,
Francis, for a
yeah,
second? Because
sure.
Karen and
Yeah,
Nana, I think it is. I haven't seen
yeah.
your face, but I love your artwork.
Mm.
Um, I just want to say, like for me, the greatest education system I've ever experienced, witnessed, and kids I know all went to Steiner
Yeah,
School, right?
yeah.
So that's
They
great.
do
That
self-governance. Both do self-governance.
amazing kids. They're Steiner parents on
Yeah.
this. I wish if I could have my druthers and have my time again with my kids, I'd do the Steiner School thing. As it is, my kids say in the normal world they act like they're homeschool kids, which is hilarious.
Ah,
But the idea of using AI to do individual mentoring of each child so that they get to competence for 2.5 hours a day, you could spend the rest of the day on nervous system work,
exactly. They do stuff
life
like meditation
skills.
and breathing. You know, they
Yeah.
have the time.
Yeah, I agree that branding Alpha School is
Oh, I hate
annoying
it.
because
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
so bad because they're talking about a dominance paradigm, not a partnership paradigm. But
Yeah.
you don't want to be like yes and right? All great
So Barry, I'll
conversations.
give you an example, like from a Steiner perspective, right? So starting with like second or third grade, they let the kids write all the rules for the school to the point where even the academic goals, like the idea of like how many units of progress should be expected of a child per week. You know, they did an experiment, I think a year ago or something. They started allowing kids to vote in these rules. And the first week, they voted for like 16 units. And, you know, 16 units is way too low. Like they told this to the head of school, and McKinsey was like, that's way too low. You can't do 16 units. And they were like, wait, oh, that's a key thing. The teachers in these schools are known as guides. because they're not supposed to teach academic subjects. They're supposed to get to know your child, understand what matters to them, what motivates them, help them if they get frustrated, help them if they run into other stumbles, help them develop navigational skills for like, how do I solve problems? The guides were like, no, 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 trust the process. And so a week later, they came back and the kids were like, oh, most kids are hitting their goals on like Tuesday or Wednesday. Like, this is clearly not a high enough goal. So they voted a higher number. And they came back again a week later and they said, still, this is not high enough. And they voted in an even higher number. And they went back to McKinsey and they said, this is what the kids have decided on. And the kids themselves, given a chance to figure out their own boundaries and capabilities, chose a goal that was higher than what the teachers would have picked for them themselves. Right. And so one of the things that I think is going to be a fascinating thing to shake out of this experiment is like, what happens when you let kids, you trust kids to motivate themselves? Like, can you create these systems where, because you are teaching and actively cultivating self-governance and putting in a place where you expect a lot of kids and you give them a lot of support, what becomes possible?
Yeah. And I want to say about that, it reminds me, our mutual friend, Daniel Schmachtenberger, once said to me, you can tell by the depth of an adult that you're talking to and the conversation that you're having with them and the questions they're asking, the depth of respect and attention that they were given in their childhood. Because the value,
fascinating.
Yeah, the
Fascinating. Yeah.
the value of the discourse that was placed. But he said you can also tell the depth of the adults that were around them for what they allowed, for what they didn't know. And I think our kids are growing up in a world that is going to have to convene with, contend with, and partner with artificial intelligence. We are 1 minute to our closing. I want to say,
Can I sneak in one more thing?
1 minute,
so
but it's got to be 20 seconds. Fast.
Okay, good. Okay. So the thing that I think is important about this method, though, for education is they come in and say, in a world where knowledge can be scaled, expertise can be scaled, what matters for humans? And what matters for humans at that point is self-governance and the ability to be inspired and to recognize when you're inspired and to be able to set goals and go and have the persistence to execute on those things. Because you will now have an army of agents that help you do that. But if you don't cultivate that in children, they're not going to be able to explore in a world of AI. So that's my little 20-second thing.
Amen. And I'll add to that high relationality. We need to teach our children to look, what does it mean to be human? It's to relate and connect. And that is fraying so much. So blended ideas like the Alpha School, Steiner fused with AI education and mentoring. I mean, hell, I'd love to learn from Socrates personally. And that could happen with AI. People on the call who've stayed, thank you. So grateful for everyone on this call. You're all doing amazing work from what I've scanned. You're all incredible people. Let's enhance the social infrastructure that gets us to a future we want to leave our children. Frances Haugen, you're a legend. Thank you and see you soon.